All right. After this, we come back to the Gulf of Mexico, just an extreme case of cultural eutrophication. As agriculture picked up, the use of fertilizers picked up, and so this whole problem got a whole lot worse. It's still an issue today, even with some of the precautions or more precautions that we're taking, just because it's just a massive amount of people contributing to it because it's such a large watershed. I provided you guys with these two images. This one I told you to label as cultural eutrophication because it's trying to show this actual process of overload, the algal bloom. You get this death and decay, and so oxygen levels go down. This is just an image of how massive these oxygen deprived hypoxic areas can be. So it's not just isolated little spots. There can be miles worth of these dead zones. Great Lakes, the Great Lakes we look at for a lot of different case studies. Uh, Wastewater, poor wastewater management, runoff from suburbia, industrial pollutants, some of the legacy pollutants that don't go away, invasive species. There's a ton of things we look at the Great Lakes for, but in this case, we're specifically looking at a lot of these things that we didn't take care of properly as the population grew, overloaded the Great Lakes, and you had two countries essentially putting pollutants in from both sides. So there were massive algal blooms, massive fish kills, and a lot of that has been corrected through cooperation between the United States and Canada and the water quality protection program that they started. So it's better, but you still have the problems of a massive population, roads, streets, homes, all those types of things where you get a lot of this stuff running off. You still have problems with sewage that can overflow. Still, there's some issues with the way it's treated, but it's definitely better than it used to be. Chemicals used in agriculture, industry, transportation, and homes can spill and leak into groundwater. So with this one, as long as you know the sources of groundwater, and a little bit of what's how do you stop it from getting there. It's a major source of drinking water, not just for the world, but also for the United States population. 50% of drinking water for about is provided by groundwater. In rural populations, it's even more so. Aquifers are have a little bit more difficulty cleaning themselves out because the water moves very slowly through the aquifer. So on top of that, you don't have quite as much bacterial action to break down a lot of those organic pollutants, and so they sit there a little bit longer than they would in, say, a surface water like a lake, a river, something like that. I gave you guys a little bit better list, I think, in the notes of these types of things, but road salts, any sort of like waste lagoons, whether it's mining, industrial facilities, that type of stuff, can leach into the ground. Landfills, if they haven't been lined properly, can leach stuff into groundwater. Sewer septic tanks, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Buried gasoline and solvent tanks, where we house a lot of things. These things are really starting to deteriorate from that were put in a long time ago. So I know that coming here in the near future, a lot of scientists believe that these things are really going to start leaking into the ground, and they need to be replaced because they're not going to last forever. This is the one that I was referring to earlier that I took from, I think, the EPA website that talks specifically about what they look for in contamination. There's a lot of countries where pollution of groundwater is a major issue, and they don't necessarily realize it because you don't see it. It just, that water comes up, they see that it's toxic, so to speak. And at that point, there's not a whole lot you can do. You can purify it once it comes up, but there's no real way of treating the groundwater. Arsenic. Arsenic comes from natural sources as well as human sources. So naturally, it's found in rock. So if you drill a well in an area that's known for having high arsenic content, it's possible that it can become contaminated with arsenic. And in a lot of less developed countries, they don't necessarily have the technology to determine that or the means to determine that. In the U.S., it's mainly mining and mining processes that are contributing that arsenic, and it is a known carcinogen, so it is something that we know can cause some major issues in people, and it's blamed for thousands of deaths annually. Uh, Treatment of arsenic, this is a simple filtration system diagram, but I don't ask you about this on the test, but in the AP exam, it's one of those kind of minute details that might be good to know. So there's forms of rust, iron that actually attract or attach to the arsenic, and then it can be filtered out. Ways of kind of purifying water. In the United States, we have a reservoir purification plants, we have filtration systems, that type of stuff. Protecting watersheds that feed surface and groundwater sources is really the best thing to do. These are, methods of basically survival we look at in the United States. In other countries, this may be things that can be taught or used to actually help them purify their water and make it safe because they can boil water to kill pathogens, that type of stuff, but specifically these two in particular help to take out some of those other things. Bottled water versus tap water. There is a question on the exam about this. Uh, Bottled water, much more expensive. In the United States, our drinking water is pretty clean. It's very closely monitored, regulated, checked, more so than tap water, or more so than bottled water, excuse me. Plus, you have plastic. We have to make the bottles. That requires energy, produces waste. We have to refrigerate the bottles, so you're talking about energy to keep them cold. And then you can see here that we don't recycle a lot of them. We do, but versus the amount that goes into landfills or gets thrown somewhere else, it's a pretty small amount. U.S. Safe Drinking Water Act sets maximum contaminant levels for any pollutants that affect human health. The other two acts, I just realized I didn't add them in the notes, so we'll have to talk about them tomorrow. But the Clean Water Act and the Water Quality Act. Clean Water Act, basically it regulates what we can put into waterways. So from a wastewater treatment facility, industrial facility, it sets limits on what can be put into the water. The Water Quality Act looks at specific bodies of water, monitors them, checks them, makes sure they're at safe levels, and then puts action plans into place if, there's issues with certain bodies of water. The ocean pollution. Most pollution in the ocean originates from land. So the key to protecting it is not allowing those things to get in from the land. 40% of the world's population lives near the coast. A big reason why we put so much into the ocean is because so many people live near the coast. Runoff sediment is the number one pollutant by volume. With sediment, you get a lot of other things in there, including nitrates, phosphates, oil, gasoline from roadways, all that type of stuff is picked up and carried with that runoff into the ocean. In addition, in the U.S. coast, sometimes we have problems with raw sewage. We have nitrates, phosphates that we've talked about multiple times, algal blooms, dead zones that result from runoff of these particular products. You guys have this diagram that gives a little more detail on the various things that end up in the ocean. But you can see there's a lot of different things that contribute to that surface runoff that makes it into the ocean and can cause problems. The Pacific garbage patches, two rotating jars. We looked at these just kind of quickly, but tiny little plastic pieces that wildlife can mistake for food. They can mistake for certain types of larvae, jellyfish, that type of stuff. There's really no practical way to clean this up. And this is really just one huge example of why plastics are such an issue. They don't all make it into the trash. Even ones you throw on the side of the road, you don't think about that can end up in the ocean, but it's going to break down. It's going to break down into little pieces. It's going to be picked up when it rains and travel down to the ocean. This is just showing you where those two gyres are in the Pacific. And that stuff just sort of sits there. And these are massive areas. And you can't see it, if you were to ride a boat through it, but because it's right at the surface in very small pieces.